Hello and welcome to Chain Reaction, a podcast series examining America's role in the world. I am your host, Aaron Stein, the Director of Research at the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia. Every 2 weeks, we will talk to experts about a variety of topics and why they matter for U.S. foreign policy. On today's show, I speak with Steven Feldstein about his new book, The Rise of Digital Repression. The discussion talked about what is digital repression, how both authoritarian and weak democratic states are using digital tools for online digital information, but also how to track and suppress their own citizens, and where this is going in the future, and perhaps potential opportunities for civil society groups to push back. Hello and welcome. Today I'm talking to Steven Feldstein, a senior fellow in the Democracy, Conflict, and Governance program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and the author of the recently released book, The Rise of Digital Repression, which you can find on Amazon. And if you look down at the bottom, we have a link in the show notes. Steven, it's great to finally catch up with you.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Well, this has been a long time in the making. Pandemic life means that my schedule isn't nearly as open as it used to be. So thanks for being flexible.
Of course. No, happy to talk.
So, I think for a lot of our listeners, the general idea of digital repression is something that they may be familiar with, but obviously your book goes into considerable more detail about what it is, what attracted you to the topic, and perhaps the problems that you see moving forward involved in this. So perhaps just give the listeners a little bit of a feel about the topic of digital repression and what attracted you to writing this book.
So, I've spent a long time working on democracy and human rights issues, particularly for the State Department, Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and other outfits. And increasingly in my work, I saw, as I would travel to different countries, new tools that governments were using to push back against demonstrators, protesters, civil society groups who were organizing us online to protest different policies that autocrats, leaders, governments were undertaking. And what I saw in particular was that governments were using surveillance methods, censorship tools, internet shutdowns, disinformation campaigns, and other new digital-based means to really consolidate their rule and ensure that some of these opposition challengers were kind of kept back and away from being able to challenge their power. And so it was those types of tools, trying to understand better how these new innovations were being used by states, what the interaction is between the deployment of these instruments and their, the advancement of their political agendas. It's that set of issues that I think both define this whole idea of digital repression and really forms the heart of the book itself.
In the introduction to the book, you raised the example of China and its use of technology both to monitor its own people, but also to suppress its own people, particularly in the Xinjiang. I can't pronounce it, but in the Uyghur regions in eastern China. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because that's obviously something that in the U.S. we're talking about a lot, given the recent national security focus on the rise of China.
So what's happening in Xinjiang is in some ways sort of represents the frontiers of where these digital repression methods really come together. And so what we're seeing is that you have a very strong overlay of traditional repression. So you have a mass incarceration, of over 1 million Uyghurs, based just on their ethnic identity. And you have extremely strong on the ground police presence as well. But what the Chinese have done is they've said this isn't sufficient, that this only gets us so far. We need a better way to monitor, track, and surveil, almost every individual who lives in the region. We want to find a way to aggregate all this data, and we want to get ahead of the curve as we start to see communications or as we start to see different types of behavior that present threats to the state. We want to identify those individuals, persecute them, pick them up, and imprison them. And so what you're seeing really is the kind of coming together in a very chilling way of traditional repression combined with these cutting edge, sophisticated digital techniques. So, I think one thing I do want to emphasize is that, the big question is, does Xinjiang represent the future, at least as it relates to authoritarian states, or is it an outlier? Is it a model that some authoritarian states may try to emulate, but that really represents a step beyond what most countries can realistically carry out? I mean, that's part of the questioning that I work through in the book.
Yeah, and one of the other things that we tend to associate these things with autocratic countries, right? Is that the capabilities to be authoritarian and to use new means of repression are some things that that like an authoritarian leader will do to quell dissent and to maintain usually his grip on power. But you talked about some of the trade-offs inherent or some of the problems between Western private firms that ultimately have business interests or ties to some of these authoritarian or semi-authoritarian states, and how the line isn't nearly as clear-cut. Can you go into that a little bit?
Yeah, I think there's sort of two ways to think about this issue. So first, when it comes to which companies are helping to drive and reinforce the technologies that underlie these digital repression strategies, they don't just aren't just sourced from other authoritarian states. Like there's a narrative that says Chinese companies like Huawei or ZTE are the ones who are primarily exporting these digital tools to other authoritarian states for digital repression purposes. In my research, I found that actually isn't really the case. While certainly Chinese companies are very active in this space, companies that come from liberal democracies, places like the United States, European countries, Israel, Japan, are also very active in providing everything from spyware to facial recognition to censorship tools. So it's a pretty prevalent problem when you look at the sourcing itself and who's providing these tools. The other small issue I want to also mention is that digital repression, while it's very strongly correlated to authoritarian states, is also something that you see happening, particularly in illiberal and weaker democracies, places like India, the Philippines, and Hungary, where you have an electoral process, but you have autocratic leading leaders. You see a lot of this type of strategies, digital repression occur in those contexts as well.
I would say that in general, there's not a broad sense idea of the way in which like leaders in these societies, both in weaker democracies or sort of competitive authoritarian states and authoritarian states, the access with which they can gain to people's lives because of the proliferation of smartphones and things like that, and how digital our lives have become. In some respects, there's two coins. Like, so on one hand, there is this digital repression using these tools to track people, potential dissidents, potential challengers to the state, but also to spread disinformation to legitimize either authoritarian or semi-authoritarian rule. What do you think about that?
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. And in fact, one of my chapters on the Philippines is really a case study in disinformation as a strategy for rule, as a strategy for governance. Because what's interesting in the Philippines is that, it's a country where some of the traditional repression tactics, like mass imprisonments, for example, aren't something that the population would really accept, don't really conform to the political norms of the country. So then the question becomes, if you want to promote your agenda, if you're a populist like Duterte, what tools can you use that will be sort of responsive to that environment? And as it turns out, distorting political narratives, intimidating critics online, pushing out falsehoods, flooding the zone with information that's propaganda. Essentially, these are all great tactics for in a liberal democracy, for a hybrid regime. And so Duterte has used this to really great effect, not only to demonize his critics, but also to prop up and enhance support among the Filipino population of his rule. And it's worked. He has remained something like 80% in terms of his approval rating. And even though there's like a dramatic number of questions and violations of human rights, because these narratives are so powerful, particularly via Facebook in the Philippines, he's been able to, perpetuate essentially a disinformation machine that's really unparalleled in terms of what we've seen.
I'm curious how these authoritarian governments. So, like, I know that you mentioned Iran in your book as well, but one of the things that we saw in Iran was sort of a decade apart mass popular mobilization in the street. You had the 2009 protests, then you had the 2019 protests, and one of the major things that I remember back in 2009 was efforts by countries, particularly the United States, to circumvent sort of earlier efforts to digitally repress those protest movements, whether it be shutting down the internet or throttling bandwidth on networks to make the recording of videos more difficult, or to make the dissemination of non-government controlled messaging more difficult via, basically basic citizens. How have you seen in the course of your research how these authoritarian states who gravitate towards digital repression, both as a strategy for governance and as a strategy to retain power, how they view potential acts by the US or the Western democracies to try and get around this. Do they view this as a threat, and is it driving sort of a race to the bottom, or do you see a potential different pathway emerging?
It's very much a cat and mouse struggle in terms of, particularly authoritarian governments coming up with new ways, new creative ways to push back against protesters and different types of movements. And those movements themselves looking to democracies to help, provide pressure, whether it's pressure for technology companies to keep certain channels, communication channels open, or pressure in terms of getting resources and material support technologies that can help them circumvent these restrictions. And sometimes you can have a little bit of both occur at the same time, where the U.S. or other democracies will have a strategic relationship with a certain authoritarian country. Let's take Uganda, good case in point, right? Where there is an ongoing relationship, while at the same time there's a second level of human rights violations that are digital in nature when it comes to using spyware against opposition politicians, social media monitoring, and throttling of the internet occurring in that country. Steps that the U.S. is condemning, and the U.S. is also providing support to some of the civil society activists who are pushing back against the leadership there. So you're seeing a little bit of both taking place, and that's unfortunately the nature of things when it comes to repression combined with or juxtaposed against strategic interests as well.
Can you talk a little bit about the tiers of countries? So we let out this we began this conversation with the focus on China, and perhaps you can come back to them. But at least if you're following this at a distance, like I am, that you see these sort of stories about the pervasiveness of things like facial recognition technology, the sort of use now and potential uses in the future of artificial intelligence to enhance both the use of facial recognition and, as an outgrowth of that, broader societal repression, versus perhaps maybe a country like Sudan or others that don't necessarily have those financial resources, but have a number of tools in their toolkit that they can use. Can you just talk about sort of the variations and differences that you came across in your research?
Yeah, there's a couple interesting ways to slice that question. So I think first of all, what's important to sort of think about is that there certainly are different levels of sophistication that you see. And so the kind of tactics that you would see in China or Russia, which have very well developed industrial capacities, large resources that are at their disposal, you'll see a much higher degree of sophistication than you would see in a place like Ethiopia or Sudan, which I think resort to much cruder digital tactics to suppress dissent, namely internet shutdowns and the targeted persecution of particular online civil society or opposition leaders. Like those tend to be the primary tactics there. And so in that sense, you do have a variation. And then, in other words, that digital repression isn't a one size fits all strategy. I mean, it really can be used, and it adapts to the particular capabilities of a country in place. But the second thing I'd also want to mention is that in addition just to having a resource capacity question, there's also an issue of the security forces and intelligence forces themselves. And that it's not enough just to have a lot of money. You also have to have a highly developed, high capacity, well-resourced security services that are able to make actionable the intelligence, the information that is gathered to actually do something with that. And so in that sense, China has, very well-organized, very well-resourced security forces. So they are able to take the information that's gleaned from the algorithms, from surveillance, and to actually implement a policy or implement enforcement actions as a result. Many other countries are unable to actually do that second thing. So even if they have very sophisticated surveillance systems, without having correlating security forces, it doesn't mean all that much. It's a little bit more theater than reality.
In what respects has there been a private sort of a market that's developed around the desire for digital repression? You certainly read about, in the case of the Saudis, but also the Emiratis and even allegations of the Qataris, that perhaps don't necessarily have that indigenous capabilities or homegrown talent quite yet to staff these types of intelligence apparatuses to try and monitor their citizens digitally. But there are firms that offer these services, often often with hired help, i.e., expats. A lot of them are Americans, Westerns, or even Israelis. Can you talk a little bit about the rise of the digital repressors for hire market that's
Yeah.
coming out?
No, it's a good question. So first of all, there's a very large market, and you see these. I haven't been to one yet, but maybe at some future point I'd like to visit. You see these trade shows that take place in locations like Dubai, where you get all sorts of high-tech manufacturers of surveillance equipment, censorship blocking tools, and so forth, who gather together and sort of peddle their wares. So you have that issue that's outstanding. And one of the things that I saw as I put together a digital repression index and I measured capacity globally versus the actual levels of digital repression occurring is that there's a big gap in authoritarian countries. In other words, they repress more than they actually have the capacity to implement those strategies, which means that in order to make up that gap, they have to source from externally some of this either expertise or equipment. And so, a number of the stories and anecdotes that I include in the book involve, ex-NSA operatives who are working with, the UAE and Qatar to, target dissenters, independent journalists, and so forth. Israel has a very well-developed kind of sort of security establishment linked to its intelligence agencies where it peddles spyware through a variety of companies, from Celebrite to NSO Group to many others, to authoritarian states around the world. Many other countries as well, Western countries have developed pretty sophisticated companies that provide like a full suite of services, from the technology to the actual operators who will help run these processes according to what the purpose of the government's according to what the governments want to actually accomplish with them. So yeah, I think it's a burgeoning, lucrative, sophisticated industry, and it's one that's really spread around the world.
So, if you had to encapsulate, sort of, as we wrap up here, where is this going? I think a lot of people are, let's say, uncomfortable about where this is going and feel a little bit sort of uncertain about the future and the ability of either governments or firms to monitor them using digital means, and what that means for governments with ill intent to basically keep themselves in power. So, like what's the big takeaway if you had to summarize it?
Well, look, digital oppression is a serious and growing trend. We have to think about it in very concrete ways in terms of what it means. I think that, ultimately, digital oppression is something that is reflective of the underlying political systems in place. So as you see a growing resurgence of authoritarian states, you're also seeing them take up and use these tools to greater effect. That's real, it's meaningful, and something that democracies and activists around the world have to take seriously. But the other thing I would say, and something I really tried to emphasize in my last chapter, is that I don't think it's a foreordained conclusion in terms of digital oppression being the end all, and that it's as much more of an adaptive struggle, and that just as governments are able to use these repressive tools to accomplish pretty sinister objectives, activists on the ground, civil society groups, and others have also been able to use these tools to their own benefit, whether it's organizing mass protest movements, finding ways to uncover complicity or corruption in authoritarian systems, or even just spreading the message about violent human rights abuses taking place in countries like Iran or Sudan, that the world can then see and hopefully hold these governments to account. So in other words, I don't think we know the conclusion about where this ends. What I do anticipate and predict is that this will become a real battleground for democracy and human rights in the coming years. And we owe it to those activists on the ground to really think about how we can help support their cause and push back against some of these violations of political freedoms.
Steven, thanks for joining me, and thanks for writing the book. And I encourage everybody to go check it out. With that, have a good rest of your day, and thanks for the conversation.
Great, thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of Chain Reaction. Be sure to subscribe to Chain Reaction on iTunes and Spotify, and don't forget to follow us on Twitter at the handle @FPRI. Chain Reaction is a podcast of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, a nonpartisan think tank in Philadelphia. For more information about this and other initiatives, be sure to visit www.fpri.org.